let's talk about this phone. I've been using this phone as my daily driver since the launch day, and it was an amazing daily driver. But is it still a good purchase in 2025? Let's see in details. I want to start this review by talking about the first thing you see when you unbox this phone, its design. Okay, to be honest, while the design might not be a groundbreaking one, it has its own strengths like the symmetry of the bezels, which I truly appreciate. However, I am one of the few who were sad about the flat display. I think curved display creates a better looking and more interesting front. Also, it is much more expensive to produce, so I feel like I'm getting my money's worth. But I can also acknowledge that it makes the phone much more comfortable to use in daily. What about the chassis of the phone? Well, I'm not really a fan of these sharp corners, and this phone destroyed every single case I put it in. It also makes the bezels look like they're thicker than they actually are. Back of the phone is pretty unassuming but also elegant and clean. The color choices Samsung went with might feel a bit muted for some tastes, but this simplicity can appeal to users who prefer understated elegance. I just hope Samsung chooses much interesting colors with the upcoming S25. Well, what about the elephant in the room? Titanium. Titanium feels like more of a marketing feature than a practical one in daily use. While it doesn't drastically change the experience, it is nice to see Samsung experimenting with premium materials. In daily life, I didn't feel any tangible differences between titanium and the aluminium. I think Samsung would be much better off if they spent this money to somewhere else. And let's be honest, just because the frame of the phone made out of titanium doesn't necessarily make it more durable, so I don't see any kind of utility behind it. But enough with the outside, let's talk about the inside. S24 Ultra comes with Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, which is on 3nm node. Also, it comes with decently sized 6.8-inch dynamic LTPO AMOLED 2X display with 120Hz refresh rate and 2600 nits peak brightness. Since it is an LTPO display, it can also dynamically change the screen refresh rate between 120 and 1 to conserve battery life. The screen is protected by the amazing Corning Gorilla Armor, which I will praise in detail in the upcoming section. It is of course IP68 rated and comes with 12GB of RAM. Your storage options are 256, 112 or 1TB, which are all UFS 4.0 with amazing read and write speeds. If you ask me, I will highly recommend going at least for the 512 version because when you take a lot of 4K 60fps HDR10 plus videos, well, that space fills up really fast, and believe me, you will want to shoot videos with this phone. Before going in depth with every spec, I just want to mention a couple of small features of this phone. First, let's talk about the charging speeds. S24 Ultra supports 45W wired charging with power delivery 3.0. However, the power adapter is not included in the box, so you have to buy it separately. USB port is Type-C 3.2 Gen 1 and supports DisplayPort 1.2 video outputs. With this feature alone, it is one of the best phones in its category. Device also supports 15W wireless charging and 4.5W reverse wireless charging. But I almost never use any of them since both the normal and reverse wireless charging are extremely slow and also generates a lot of heat, which is not good for the lifespan of the battery. But having the option is all that matters. S24 Ultra is using the same vibration motor as we've seen in S23 Ultra. Even though it's a really strong vibration motor, it lacks the refinement and the tactility of its competitors. When you compare it with Google, Apple, Xiaomi, and OnePlus, it kind of feels cheap. Phone has stereo speakers, one is front firing in the earpiece and one at the bottom. They're loud but lack low-end clarity. Therefore, again in its class, it's behind its competitors. However, with a good equalizer setting, it is good enough speaker system. Well, when it comes to the microphones though, story couldn't be further from the speakers. S24 Ultra has one of the best, if not the best, microphones that I have ever seen in a phone. Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, S Pen. You either love it and can't live without it, or you couldn't care less about it. I personally will put myself in the latter group. However, this doesn't mean that S Pen is not a really powerful tool. It is not just simply a stylus, but also a very versatile remote control for your device. You can take pictures or change the music you are listening to by simply using the air gestures, and believe me, they work flawlessly. Now I want to talk about a bit more important features of this device, starting with the display. First, I want to talk about the Corning Gorilla Armor. It was advertised as more scratch resistant and less reflective than the previous iterations, and boy, it delivers. It is simply amazing to use this phone outside on direct sunlight since it basically has no reflections. Another benefit of less reflections is that blacks are deeper than a regular AMOLED display. When you put another AMOLED display side by side, the difference is beyond this world. What about the scratch resistance part? Well, folk, they were absolutely true. I used this phone since its launch day without a screen protector, and my device doesn't even have any micro scratches. This is basically a dream come true for me because I am one of those persons who hate screen protectors. However, when it comes to the actual display, I can only express my disappointment, unfortunately. To start things off, the display of S24 Ultra is only an 8-bit panel. In this day and age, it is unacceptable. Especially when you account that the competitors like Oppo and OnePlus are using 10-bit displays. Moreover, Xiaomi is using 12-bit displays on their phones. If you're not familiar with these numbers, let me explain. The color gamut or the bits of the display explain how many colors a single pixel can produce. An 8-bit display can produce approximately 16 million colors. But this scale is exponential. Thus, a 10-bit display can produce 1 billion colors, and a 12-bit display can produce 68 billion colors. Compared to competitors' 10-bit or 12-bit displays, the S24's 8-bit panel may exhibit occasional color banding. While it's a solid display, there is definitely a room for improvement in this category. It also has quality assurance problems and ununiformities on lighting. It's an okay display, but especially in this price bracket, these kind of Q&A problems are simply unacceptable. Samsung, please do better. But I would also like to add that in theory, driving an 8-bit display is more energy efficient than driving a 10-bit or 12-bit display. So again, in theory, S24 Ultra's display should be more energy efficient than other phones. However, I couldn't find any kind of scientific or reputable source to confirm my theories, so take it with a grain of salt. Then again, I would choose the better display over the more efficient phone. Another downside of this display is that, yes, it supports HDR10+, but it does not support Dolby Vision. So depending on your choice of video streaming platform, you might not have the option of HDR. Just be warned. Okay, let's talk about something much more positive. Biometrics. S24 Ultra uses Qualcomm's 2nd gen under-display ultrasonic fingerprint sensor, and it shows. This is by far the most reliable and the fastest under-display fingerprint sensor that I have ever used. Also, since it's an ultrasonic sensor rather than an optical one, it is inherently more secure than the other ones. A quick tap is all you need to get into this phone. For face unlock, it uses the front-facing camera and it's a 2D scan. Yes, it is less secure compared to the fingerprint sensor, but combined with that, it is really convenient to have. However, don't get me wrong, this face unlock is fast and reliable. It recognizes my face even in pitch black. So for this category, kudos to Samsung. They delivered a truly flagship experience. What about the software? The phone has released with One UI 6.1 on Android 14, and now I'm on One UI 7 Beta 2, which is on Android 15. But if you're going to buy this phone right now, it's going to be on Android 14. One UI has certainly come a long way from its TouchWiz roots, and it is simply amazing to use it daily. I have never encountered any stutters or lag even after a year of heavy use, and I have never encountered a major software bug. There has been a few minor software glitches, but they can be easily attributed to the Android and or the programs itself. So, solid 10 on stability and daily use. It is also a feature-packed interface, but it is not the most feature-packed interface out there anymore. One complaint of mine is that the implementation of new features are pretty slow on One UIs these days. Back on the old days, Samsung's phones would have a feature years before their competitors, but unfortunately it is not the case anymore. And yes, they still didn't fix the monotone theming. You still have to deactivate and reactivate the feature every single time you switch a wallpaper. Come on, Samsung. Especially with the new One UI 7 beta, animations are much smoother and overall aesthetic of the One UI is more nice. If you want to learn more about it, you can watch my video on my channel for in-depth details. Additional to all of this, Samsung has promised to give 7 major software updates for this phone. However, the quality and the truthfulness of these updates are yet to be seen. So, let us wait and see. Okay. Now let's talk about the powerhouse that runs the software. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, S24 Ultra globally comes with Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. It has 8 cores, 1 Cortex-X4 at 3.39 GHz, 3 Cortex-A 720 at 3.1 GHz, 2 Cortex-A72 at 2.9 GHz, and finally 2 Cortex-A 520 at 2.2 GHz. The GPUs are Adreno 750 at 1 GHz. As a disclaimer, like I mentioned before, I'm running the second beta of One UI 7. All the tests are conducted in a room well below the room temperature, and phone didn't have any kind of case on it. And after every single test, I waited a sufficient time to let the phone cool down. As customary, I ran all the benchmarks starting with Geekbench 6. In the CPU test, S24 Ultra got a healthy 2256 single-core and 6746 multi-core score. Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is a beast, even after a year later. What about the GPU test? I have run 2 separate tests for both Vulkan and OpenCL. The Vulkan was the better performing one with a score of 14,718. And on OpenCL, the phone got 16,014. Which means that if your game supports Vulkan API, this phone is on it. I have also ran Wildlife Extreme. S24 Ultra got 4,503 on Vulkan, which is basically crazy. What about the ray tracing performance? It is also pretty good with 7,932. As the final test, I ran Wildlife Extreme stress test. And oh boy, was it bad. S24 Ultra get an abysmal 51.5%. I didn't want to believe it, and I ran the same test 2 more times in separate occasions, but unfortunately the results were consistent. For those who do not live in benchmarks, this means that after 20 minutes of heavy use, phone almost lost half of its processing power. I'm going to be honest with you, this is terrible. But I was also curious about why could be this the case. So I have 3 theories. It is a well-known fact that 8 Gen 3 creates a lot more heat compared to 8 Gen 2. And when you combine this with an insufficient cooling, this might be one of the reasons. Second reason, and I think this is the most likely one. On modern phones, the subframe and the display are your main heat sinks to dissipate heat. As I have mentioned earlier, S25 Ultra uses titanium for its subframe rather than aluminum, like on S23 Ultra. Titanium has drastically lower thermal conductivity than aluminum, as much as 20 times. For those who are not familiar, the thermal conductivity of a material is its ability to absorb and dissipate heat energy. Therefore, S24 Ultra's titanium frame might be drastically lowering its cooling capacity. And the third reason, There can be something wrong with my firmware, since after all I'm using the beta software. However, when I looked at the temperature graphs, I didn't see any kind of weird behavior, so I don't think this is the likely cause of it. Okay, synthetic benchmarks are great and all, but they don't necessarily represent the real life usage. Then, let's see some gaming action. First, I tested Genshin Impact, the things I do for you guys. Of course, all the settings were maxed out except motion blur. The overall experience was smooth and most of the time at 60 FPS. But the keyword is almost. The stability issues we observed on benchmark shows its ugly face on real-life gaming as well. Occasionally, FPS drops to as low as 53, especially in crowded areas and when the camera is moving fast. Even though this result is not ideal, it's also not a deal breaker as well. Since the FPS drops are really small, you don't necessarily feel like the game is stuttering. So, it's not a big deal in my opinion. Second game I tested is Devil May Cry Peak of Combat. Again, every setting is maxed out. Even though DMC is not as graphically intense as Genshin Impact, it can run at 120 FPS, which stresses the GPU. After a prolonged game session, I'm happy to say that S24 Ultra can handle this game comfortably at 120 FPS. If there's any game that you want me to test in the future, just let me know down in the comments. Since we talk about the performance of this device, let's now talk about the battery life. Is it any good for prolonged gaming or productivity sessions? Well, this marks the 5th year Samsung has stuck with a 5000 mAh lithium-ion battery. While it's reliable, I do hope they consider an upgrade soon to keep up with the market trends. An upgrade to the battery is well overdue in my opinion, especially when you consider the fact that except Apple and Google, every other competitor of this phone is using at least 6000 mAh batteries. This is another spec that I cannot simply gloss over at this price bracket. On the other side, the battery optimization of the One UI is just stellar. Even though it has one of the smallest batteries in its class, it can still take some beating. Before continuing with the results, I want to share the test parameters with you. Every single test is done on daily settings and not in a sterile environment. The phone was either connected to Wi-Fi or 5G. NFC, location, and auto brightness was always on. Bluetooth was also always on, and it was either connected to my watch or my watch and my headphones at the same time. Light performance mode and power saving was off, and phone was on auto dark mode. Only if the battery dropped to 20%, power saving is activated. So in short, this is a real life usage case. I have done 2 tests, one is rich in beta and one in stable Android 14. In both cases, screen on time was comfortably over 7 hours with lots of additional standby time, which is quite amazing, especially when you think that this phone only has 5000 mAh battery. So I have to give my praises. What about the heavy use? Let me be clear guys, that day I was outside, constantly on 5G, used Google Maps actively at least 1.5 hours, and almost for the whole duration I was streaming music from Spotify and my headphones were connected with LDAC. I still had some juice when I returned home. This is just amazing. Okay, let's talk about the cameras. Well, they are hit and miss. You get 4 separate sensors. Main sensor is a 200 megapixel ISOCELL HP2 with optical image stabilization. Ultra-wide sensor is 12 megapixel Sony IMX563. It also has 2 telephoto lenses. One is a 10 megapixel Sony IMX754 at 3x, and the other is 50 megapixel Sony IMX854 at 5x. The front-facing camera is 12 megapixel, likely the sensor is S5K3LU. On the surface level, it looks decent. So let's put it to the test. The main camera and the front-facing camera is from the previous year's S23 Ultra. However, 3x sensor is 4 years old at this point, while 12 megapixel ultra-wide sensor is 5 years old. It is a bit puzzling to see that the older sensors like 3x and the ultra-wide ones are still in use. Samsung could definitely elevate the camera experience with a much more modern hardware. Yes, you might say that it's not just about the hardware and also the image processing itself, and you will be definitely correct. However, the 3x sensor and the ultra-wide is so bad at this point, no amount of software can recover them. Since I made my criticism, I can continue with the better sensors. The images I took with the main sensor is pretty good and up there with its competitors. Even in low light conditions, it delivers and I love this sensor. Front-facing camera is also quite good and it gets the job done. What about the only new sensor of this phone? 50 megapixel 5x telephoto. The sensor itself is quite powerful and takes nice photos, as long as there are lots of light. I don't recommend using this for night photography though. However, even though at 5x it delivers pretty good performance, at higher zoom levels it lags behind even S23 Ultra. Also, the software processing of the One UI is not always the best. On rare occasions, software just strikes the perfect balance and the image is just amazing. But most of the time, you have to take a couple of pictures or adjust the exposure a little bit for yourself to get the better picture. So when you compare it to Google's Pixels and iPhones, this is most definitely not a point-and-shoot camera. You have to be careful about how you shoot the photos. When it comes to the fast-moving subjects, well, just forget about this phone. Everything you shot will be almost guaranteed to be blurry. Except, this is a big except, you know what you're doing and using the manual mode. Yes, I know there will be some people in the comment section that will say this, so let me be clear. If you can use the manual mode properly, the sensors are really powerful. But most of the users use just the auto mode, so I'm just talking about the performance of auto mode. What about the videos? Well, folk, as much as I don't like the photography performance of this device, I love its video quality. In both low and normal light conditions, it takes amazing videos. I always shoot at 4K 60fps HDR10+, and I recommend those settings. If you are planning to take lots of videos, iPhone is not the only option anymore. On the videography part, well done Samsung. Lastly, I want to mention that the hardware of the device is just one part of the equation. Most of us do not change their phone every single year or every other year. We tend to use our phones at least for 3 years, so the after-sales support is one of the most, if not the most important part when it comes to purchasing these devices, especially when you think about how much they cost. And on that front, Samsung is one of the best companies that you can go for. In the past, I had problems obtaining OEM parts for my devices, which ended their life prematurely. So that is why this year I went with Samsung S24 Ultra. That was one of the biggest reasons why I have chosen S24 Ultra for my data driver, despite of its shortcomings. So depending on your region, I think the after-sales support is one of the most important factors that you should account for. With all being said, I think Samsung is doing more cost cuttings than they should, and it shows on their hardware. However, they still have one of the, if not the best, software and after-sales support. If your main focus is gaming or consistently top-notch photography in all conditions, you might want to explore other options. However, for an overall balanced experience, the S24 Ultra still holds. And that is why it was my data driver since it has launched. If you have any suggestions for the future, just let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Also, if you want to support my channel, you can do so with the link in the description. And as always, take care.